And I'd like to now introduce you our second speaker, who is John McDonnell. Welcome, John.
Thanks for inviting me along. It's a funny old world, isn't it? Because only 3 months ago in a general election, we were told there was no money for anything in terms of reversing austerity. The worst thing you could possibly do at the railways is bring them into public ownership. And my proposals for free broadband were described as a lunatic Marxist revolutionary assault on the private sector. We're just, at the moment, the Tories found 250 billion the other day to put through Parliament to deal with the crisis. They're nationalising the railways, and all of a sudden, free broadband is incredibly popular. It's a funny old world, isn't it, really? Let me tell you where we're at in terms of dealing with some of the issues themselves, and then I'll come on to the longer-term perspective. What's clear, if there's any lessons learned about all of this, is just how ill-prepared our public services were and our economy was for this sort of crisis. I spoke to Matt Rack from the FPU last week, and he reminded me, under the civil contingencies processes that governments are meant to implement when necessary, the planning that they took, that's meant to take place, is to identify what sort of issues would bring about a crisis within society and plan around it. And he reminded me that the one risk that was top of the risk list was a pandemic. And everyone seems to have forgotten in government that that's what they were supposed to be planning to ensure that we could cope with. It was a flu pandemic that was the risk in which they were meant to be training. And as Matt Rack basically pointed out, in every aspect of preparation, little work had gone on and little investment had taken place. And it wasn't just the NHS, it was social care, it was education, it was all aspects of our society. It was an absolute failure. And on top of the lack of planning, obviously you had 10 years of austerity. So where we got to 4 or 5 weeks ago in pressurizing the government to recognize that there was a serious issue here. As soon as China occurred, what happened in China occurred, you realize it was serious, but this government underestimated the threat. We had our first cases of incidents in this country in January. So there was enough time between January and into February to actually get serious about what the scale of the threat could be. I think the Johnson administration completely underestimated the threat. That's the first thing. The second thing, one of the things we've been raising, and this isn't, we're not into political point scoring, it's just practical realities of the situation, is that the World Health Organization advice was test, 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 and track. And we seem to take this bizarre theory of herd immunity and work on the basis that the more people who contract coronavirus, the safer we are, which is absolutely bizarre. The whole point about herd immunity is based upon when you've discovered a vaccine, not after you've let people suffer and some of them die. So the reason I think we're experiencing the problems that we are at the moment is that there was an underestimation of the threat itself, and then secondly, a failure to act fast and big, because you need quite a significant, obviously now, a significant response overall. So what we're doing with the government at the moment is we're trying to engage in as many talks as we possibly can to move them on. On the NHS front, let's just deal with that. Pushing them all the time now in terms of investment. The tragedy is, you've seen we've lost 3 doctors over the last week. And it's the real concerns that NHS staff have got is it isn't just about beds, it is about PPE, the protective equipment that they need. And also, well, the fact that NHS staff themselves now are going sick in large numbers. In my constituency, Northwick Park, only 10 days ago declared a critical incident. In other words, they ran out of beds. That's the hospital that serves alongside Hillingdon Hospital, my constituency, and it was terrifying, to be frank. Now they've built the 4,000 unit across in East London. At least they've got a grip at some element of that, the same as happening in Wales and the Midlands and Scotland. But it took tragedies to force this government into action. That was the first point in terms of the NHS. The big fear that we've got, and I don't want to worry people, but the big fear that we've got now is in social care and what happens in residential establishments in particular, but also social care for people within their own homes. And I just give the example of you'll have a carer moving from home to home, dealing with individuals. And remember, there's already over 1 million people not getting the social care they need in this country. But you have social carers moving from home to home, and they haven't yet been supplied with sufficient protective equipment. And we've been talking to some of their representatives today about what we do in terms of forcing the government to act on this. So I think in social care, we're in an incredibly dangerous situation. And you've seen what's happened elsewhere in Europe within some of the residential establishments about what happens when the virus outbreak impacts upon elderly people in particular. So there's a real worry about all of that. And it just highlights, exactly as Mark said, it just highlights the lack of investment. 10 years of austerity. Social care was already in crisis. In the NHS, 50,000 nurses vacancies. In social care, at least that. In fact, one figure is 120,000 vacancies. And the Brexit issue doesn't help either, because a lot of the workers that were working in social care for other parts of Europe, and many of those now are no longer with us. They've gone home. So again, we're in an extremely difficult position. We're putting pressure on the government now to make sure resources go into social care, but also through local authorities as well. And remember, social care is largely privatized now. So there are real practical issues about the delivery of the health service and social care overall. The next issue then is what happens to support people in effectively what is meant to be some form of lockdown or enforced social protection and social distancing. And one of the issues we've been raising with the government, and Jeremy's raising it again today in a letter to Boris Johnson, is first of all the mixed messaging from government about this supposed lockdown. Because what's happening is that the message from government is that businesses shouldn't be operating unless they're essential businesses, or if they can operate with social protection and social distancing. What we're finding, report after report from all over the country, whereby businesses are still operating. They're not. You could not classify them as essential. For example, building flats, homes all around the country. And secondly, they're not operating under social protection rules or social distancing. And the examples are pretty horrendous on construction sites in particular, but also in call centres. And in fact, one of the call centres where there's people packed together is actually one of the ones giving NHS advice. It's a bizarre and dangerous situation that we're in. So we've been saying to the government over the last fortnight, but certainly we've hyped it over the last few days, is that there needs to be, first of all, clear messaging about what a lockdown should be, and there should be enforcement against those employers that are operating, those companies that are operating contrary to what the advice is. And in addition to that, those employers that are forcing workers into work in unsafe conditions. And we're getting, as I say, reports from all over the country. I'm inundated with emails and contact from workers who've been forced into work. They're not in essential industries by any means, or essential businesses. They're not playing an essential role, and they're working in unsafe conditions. And if anyone wants to go and have a look at some of the filming that's taken place in my constituency at Heathrow, you'll see that there's lack of protective gear, at the same time people queuing up, and it's overcrowded in individual terminals. There's a real anxiety there, so we're trying to put pressure on government now to get its act together, but also to get some enforcement on all of this. The other issue then is if people can't go to work, what happens in terms of them being able to support themselves? Now, the government has introduced the job retention scheme where workers are meant to be furloughed. What we're finding on that is, first of all, large numbers of companies are not participating in the scheme. Secondly, reduced hours, people working reduced hours are not covered either. And there's a whole range of gaps within the scheme itself, particularly around people working in the gig economy, freelancers, etc. And we've been raising issue after issue of government. I met with a teleconference on Friday with Treasury civil servants and Cabinet Office civil servants to set out a whole range of issues that they had to address because the job retention scheme is not working. And remember, even those participants are only getting 80% of their wages. And we've said to them, 80% of low wages is taking some people below the national minimum wage. We argue for 100% because we felt that if you're going to get through this, people have got to be protected. Again, what they came forward then with their proposals with regard to universal credit. We said so if someone goes off sick or signs off in self-isolation and they claim statutory sick pay, one, there shouldn't be a £118 bottom limit in terms of access. If you don't earn above that, you don't access statutory sick pay. And secondly, well, statutory sick pay is £94.25 a week. When Hancock was asked, could you live on that? He said no. Well, if he can't, neither can the other working people either. We've said any benefits now should be related to the real living wage and that people should actually be able to survive. And we've said that's the same whether on job seekers allowance, employment support allowance, or carers allowance. Carers allowance is £66 a week. It is appalling. The levels of poverty in this country relate not just to those out of work, but those who are in work as well. And we've also argued that actually one of the quickest ways to get money to people would be to increase child benefit immediately. We're saying just £10 on child benefit immediately. You can get that out the door and pay to people fairly quickly. The other issue then that they raised then, after a week of pressing them, we submitted our proposals 2 weeks ago. After a week of pressing them, they then brought forward the support for the self-employed. And again there, huge gaps in terms of self-employment, particularly with regard, and I go back to the construction sector because there's large numbers of workers, but it's happened in education as well, where people have been forced into umbrella companies or payroll agencies, and in that way classified as self-employed, but actually for the large part of their wages are determined by the employers. And they're pushed into the situation where they classify themselves as self-employed, but it's bogus self-employment. When we had the discussions with ministers in the civil service, they didn't seem to even recognise it was a problem. So we're arguing at the moment about improvements in all of those schemes to make sure people get proper wage protection and income protection, and also that we have benefits levels increased. The other thing you've seen that we've tried to do, we nearly got there, not far enough, is to have a ban on all evictions during this period. But there's no point in banning evictions if people are then racking up rental debts, because all that means is they just have longer to pack before they get thrown out. So we've said rental payments should be covered as well. There's some movement on housing allowance, but nowhere near enough. We've also raised with the government over the weekend the issue of utility bills. And again, we're concerned that particularly on energy, there could be disconnections if we're not careful. So we're saying the utility bills should be covered too. Similar support for council. Is that asking for the moon? No, it isn't. If they can bring forward 250 billion to support businesses in loans, they can support ordinary working people. That's what this is about. I just finish on these. The issue is we're trying to deal with a crisis, but actually don't think that the right will let this crisis go to waste. They will use it for another assault of austerity on our public services, and they will use it to restructure their economy in their interests. And I just give you one example today. Today is the day when the minimum wage, what the Tories call the living wage, it's not a living wage, but it goes up today. There was a lobby to prevent the minimum wage going up by businesses and by some think tanks on the basis that this would be too big a burden on businesses. That's the sort of thinking that's taking place on the right about how they can use this crisis to restructure the economy overall to maintain and develop their profitability in the future. What we've got to do now is have an earnest and thorough discussion about the sort of society that we want after this crisis. We've proved, this crisis has proved austerity doesn't work. You have to have a society where you invest in your public services so that they have a resilience to meet the needs of the community, both on an everyday level, but also when crises occur. But in addition to that, resilience within individuals and families so they have a decent wage and not insecure work. And what we've got to do now is look at the sort of society that we want based upon, well, what's going to get us through this crisis? Solidarity. That's the sort of society that we need to be debating now.